Renton is looking at a really interesting association between interreligious contact and other measures as they relate to bias towards specific groups. I love this paper. I think it's really, really interesting. And the measure of interreligious contact is actually being assessed with two different variables. So my one concern here is to make sure that these two variables go together well. Basically test whether or not one or the other is tapping the same concept, but the same concept independently. If these two variables are actually tapping the same thing the same way, putting them in the same analysis creates a lot of problems. However, I do think it's really fascinating for us to think about how one concept can be captured with multiple dimensions. Now, the other issue I wanted to raise with you is the issue of coding. And all of you were very specific about your coding, but some of you were obviously sort of struggling with the question of how to code a variable and whether or not you should go continuous or dichotomous. Cassidy, I'm looking at you. Now, Cassidy's study is a really interesting exploration of microaggressions as they relate, actually microaggressions of white students, and looking at kind of different ways that we can code microaggressions. And these type of coding questions are really, really interesting. You could go dichotomous, looking at whether or not someone experiences something at all versus someone doesn't experience it. Or you could look at it continuously. How many events have you experienced? The real answer to that depends on what your variable is aiming to capture and your understanding of the differences between categories. What does it mean to move from the 0 to the 1, or the 0 to the 1 to the 2? And if you were to say dichotomize a previously continuous variable, do you get so much heterogeneity in the 1 that it actually stops making sense as a category? That's the real issue you should be thinking about. The third issue I wanted to talk about was composite measures. So several of you, actually all of you, have some really interesting variables, tapping some really interesting concepts, but some of you are combining variables to capture one concept. Alex, we're talking about collective strain. Now, Alex's study is really fascinating because it's tapping into this great question about how does your network actually impact your likelihood to recover from a disaster. And Alex is bringing together a ton of really interesting variables to make a composite measure of collective strain. This is hard work. And so my critique here, and this is again basically just advice that everyone can follow with any of their work, is to just clarify exactly what the goal is. Begin the paragraph with, to measure this concept, I'm drawing on 3 different variables, measuring A, B, and C, and ensure that the reader knows how this composite measure is supposed to be interpreted. So that's all I've got for your data and methods sections critiques. Again, I am really excited about seeing where these papers go next, and I'm also excited to see you all on Tuesday. Take care.